A bold vision to be sure, but we're going to talk about just how feasible it is to close Rikers. So open or closed. First slide here. We're going to be looking at the complex itself. So Rikers Island sits on a 400-acre island that serves as New York's principal jail complex. There are about 10 facilities that actually house people, including a facility for women and adolescents, the regular male inmates, as well as an infirmary, a power plant, and a bakery. It's sort of a self-sufficient little island out there. The corrections department, also in addition to Rikers and the facilities on it, runs 4 different borough jails in Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. Moving on, looking at Rikers Island a little bit more in depth, there's a population of between 95 and 11,000 people floating in and out right now on a daily basis, but there are a total of about 77,000 folks who cycle in throughout the year. The capacity of the prison is about 24,000 maximum, but there's definitely safety issues when you get up in those numbers. African Americans and Latinos from low-income neighborhoods make up the majority of the inmates who are currently in Rikers. Next slide here. The latest figures, as reported in 2014, 85% of the people at Rikers Island have not had a trial or been convicted of a crime. It's a place for holding folks until they get to that point. And there are 400 people who've been at Rikers for at least 2 years without being convicted of a crime. Half a dozen have been there 6 years without being convicted of a crime. If you can imagine 6 years waiting to even be convicted of something. A little bit more about that. 1,400 people have waited for the last year to have their cases settled. And some crimes that wouldn't even draw sentences as long as they've been in there waiting for a sentence if they were found guilty. And a 2012 survey of women at Rikers found that 5.9% of them reported being sexually victimized by staff members who are at the prison. So last thing here, open or closed, it's definitely a controversial plan that's drawing a lot of attention and some great conversation. Here's Aaron.
Thanks, Brian. Well, the voices asking for Rikers to be shut down seem to be getting louder by the minute, and the politics more heated over questions like, should it be shut down? Can it be closed? Where to put all of those inmates? Well, right now, we want to welcome Khalil Cumberbatch, Manager of Training and Communication at Just Leadership USA. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And we want to welcome back Tina Luongo, the attorney in charge of criminal practice at the Legal Aid Society. And welcome back to BK Live.
Hi, glad to be back.
Now, Brian just gave us some amazing statistics, but first off, what are the arguments for closing Rikers from your perspective?
It's a dysfunctional facility, it's an antiquated facility, and it is a facility that isolates everybody on that island, such to the degree that for a decade or so, there were several whistleblowers that have been shouting from the rooftops. Our Prisoners' Rights Project included many activists in the community who were sort of trying to get the stories of our clients out there. And because it was so isolated, frankly, we were shouting from rooftops on deaf ears. It wasn't until it started to really get on the radar of the general public. And when you take sort of all that is at Rikers, the dysfunction, the poor supervision of staff, the corrections staff, and putting a population away from their families, away from their communities, you're bound to actually have what's been happening. So the only difference now is we're having a conversation about it, but these are problems that have been going on for decades.
So how would closing down those facilities, the actual physical plant, affect any of those things when so much of the problem seems to be bad criminal justice to begin with? And this seems to be a symptom of it. If you're waiting longer than you would have even been convicted of something, had you had the opportunity to be convicted, that's not a problem of brick and mortar.
Yeah, I mean, for someone who myself has been on Rikers Island, you know, it has a permeating culture of violence, and that's something that is only present on Rikers Island. I mean, of course, violence happens in any jail, in any facility, in any prison, but the reality is that violence is something that is perpetrated not only by staff but by folk there as well, because largely, you know, it is something that is accepted and is something that is in many cases promoted.
You know, I think you hit on sort of the real important conversation. So we've heard, right, we're hearing sort of, and I think you talked about it, can you actually shut it? Are these numbers 9,500, 10,000? Is that too large to sort of think about sort of moving into smaller facilities? Well, for the last year or so, this city's administration, along with district attorneys, the defense bar, have been having conversations about first looking at the issue of bail, right? What brings people to Rikers Island? What brings people, that's right.
Yeah.
You're setting bail on people for our clients, the 200,000 New Yorkers that we represent every year as the primary public defender. $250,000 could be $1 million. They're not getting out. And so what you see, 85% of the population at Rikers, much of that are people who are in on low-level misdemeanors, who can't afford bail, who after they're in about 7 or 10 days, surprise, surprise, they plead guilty. Why? Because they have to get off the island. So let's first have a conversation about that. Let's have a conversation about broken windows. Let's have a conversation about bail. Let's have a conversation to say, are these people that need to be actually detained, or can we actually create a fair, just system that says these people, while they're out, they should be out in their communities with their families, doing what they should be doing for themselves and their families while they're pending trial, and give them a chance to actually have a trial. So that, if you look at that, then you're reducing the population from 9,500 to a manageable number, right? And then you can have the conversation about, can we sort of move this to the community?
Well, do we know what that ideal or goal-setting number would be in order to truly have that conversation? I think Commissioner Bratton, just on a radio show this week, he was saying that it didn't seem feasible because nobody, as we said before, wants to have a jail in their neighborhood. So what would be the ideal number in order to even close Rikers? Has anyone sort of
So I would say
number?
the ideal number is anywhere between 4,500 and 5,500 people, which we look at, so right now that's about half of the current population. So if we look historically, as was mentioned earlier, at its highest peak, Rikers population was about 24,000. Now it's down to about 9,800 or 9,400 or so. So in the end, right, like 10 years ago, they would have said the same exact thing, that it's impossible to get the population down by 50%. So we're talking about something that has been done historically. We're talking about something that is feasible. But in the end, what we're talking about is political will, right? We have to push the mayor to invest some political will into saying, yes, that we do actually want to get the population down that low. And there are already steps being taken, right? And some of it is going to help now that the speaker is on board in terms of, putting together a plan and a commission on how to take those steps. But in the end, it is something that is feasible.
So is this whole notion of closing Rikers sort of a red herring just to get folks talking about the reforms that need to happen in the criminal justice system? Because, okay, we've got an island, and if you feel a certain way about shutting that down and dispersing people who are in the prison population across different boroughs, it'll really kick people in the butt to get them active about changing the system.
I hope it's not a red herring. I hope the end result is that we can actually come up with a better model. Other jurisdictions, by the way, have done this. And there are experts that know exactly how to create safe environments and have moved away from large jail complexes.
Brad Lander's one of the most influential folks in the city council now, and he fought for a long time to get a facility in Gowanus and was routinely trounced because he wanted parolees even. Yeah. And now we've got Toll Brothers building on a Superfund site to bring condos, but no one wants parolees in the neighborhood. Wow. Where can we get it done?
Yeah, so I would say that the not in my backyard, the NIMBY mentality has never worked, right? I mean, in the end, we're talking about a huge majority of people that are ultimately going to be released to the community. And if they're released in a way where they're not supported, whether that's in a community or whether that's in my community, community or your community, in the end, they have to be released to society, back into community. So whether that's in Brownsville or uptown or downtown, in the end, we have to be thinking about how to give these people everything that they need in terms of resources. And some of that conversation is where should people be returning to, right? Because in the end, even if you've been on Rikers Island for 4 or 5 months, 4 or 5 years, if you leave with a criminal conviction, it's not hard to get back into places like NYCHA. It's hard to find adequate housing. So yes, people are going to also need the opportunity to successfully reenter and find housing. So whether that's in, you know, as I said, in certain parts of Brooklyn or certain parts of Queens, in the end, it's a conversation that is inevitable.
Okay. Now, you said about an inevitable conversation, but is there a case to be made for keeping Rikers open?
So of course, I think that, you know, I think that that's probably the easiest case to make, right? Because it's because it's talking about something that is already in existence. What we're talking about now is a bold and audacious idea. And that anytime you enter a bold and audacious idea into the conversation, people are always going to automatically revert to what they know, because people are fearsome of failing. You know, in this case, people are fearsome of putting their name on the line, putting their reputation on the line. So yes, there's always a case to be made for the opposite side, so to speak. But what we're talking about here in the end are people. Right? We're talking about human beings who are not things to be thrown away, or not things to be put out of sight. One of the main things that the speaker said during her speech was that we need to make the criminal justice, we need to bring it out of the shadows. Because it's a conversation that all of us, in some shape, form, or fashion, support, because we pay our taxes, because we vote for a certain politician. But in the end, it's our responsibility, not just the advocates or the lawyers or the speaker, but it's all of our responsibility.
We also have to recognize that even if the goal ultimately is to shut Rikers, it's not going to happen tomorrow. So right now, right here, the reforms have got to happen. The violence has got to stop. The sexual assault of women and trans inmates have to stop. The harassment and sexual harassment of visitors has to stop. And we need to have accountability and transparency about what's going on. So even you can have these conversations at the same time. It's not going to close tomorrow. We all know that. But we need to take a very, very close look and continue to monitor and continue to advocate for the people that are on that island who are away from their families. And frankly, we're very sort of disheartened by the fact that if you even try to go visit your loved one, now you're getting sexually assaulted. So now families are deciding not to go visit. And research shows that when people are connected to their families when they are incarcerated, they have a higher chance of success in reuniting into the community. So when we look at not in my backyard, we better start recognizing that the people at Rikers are our neighbors, our fellow New Yorkers, who are going to need to be able to re-enter our communities, all communities, with the same opportunities so that they can stay in our communities. Otherwise, we're just going to keep cycling people. The other point to make is we already have detention centers in communities, and there hasn't been a problem. There's one down the street. There's one in Manhattan, right? There's one. There's a boat in the Bronx. So we have data to support that you could move people into communities and have them closer, so the travel time is not hours when they go to trial. It should not be a hardship to their families. It should not be a cost. The amount of money it costs to run Rikers Island and transport people back and forth, hours in traffic on the BQE to get to their trial. It's not only costly, it's unjust. People simply have to get woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning to get to court.
Tina, like the speaker has been routinely criticized in some segments for being soft on crime. Like, you want to pay for their bail, you want to shut down the prison. She's so soft on crime. What do you say to the law and order types who say, you know what? You did the crime and you do the time. And I know that it's a crappy argument because a lot of people here haven't been convicted of anything and they're waiting for years. But there are people who love the idea of sticking someone on an island where it's like, that's an island. It's a perfect place to put people who are bad.
We could forget all about those people, right? That's because it's who those people are. You start looking at, start trying to incarcerate white teenagers. we may be having a very different conversation about moving justice into communities. And in fact, we see that, by the way, in our juvenile justice, right? Legal Aid Society's juvenile rights practice was on cutting edge to bring kids close to home. Why do you think you had that movement, right? It was because it was so important to bring kids back to New York.
Yeah, and so just to add to the point about, what I would say to someone who is totally in agreement with the idea of if you can't do the time, then you shouldn't do the crime, as you stated, right? Over 85% of people on Rikers Island have not been convicted of a crime. They are literally languishing in detention. So that's the first point. The second point is that, again, we're talking about human beings, right? We're talking about people that are going to make mistakes, but the larger conversation is really about socioeconomic issues, right? I mean, myself, I grew up in a neighborhood in Queens called South Jamaica, Queens. It's one of 7 neighborhoods in the New York City area that feed over 70% of the New York State prison population. And that is $1 million blocks, there's $1 billion blocks, and in the end, we're talking about people who have been given, in many cases, the lesser of 2 evils, but nevertheless 2 evils to choose from.
So we've gone over, but I know Darcel Clark has been on the job for like 5 minutes, and Rikers is in her jurisdiction, and she's laid out some reforms and things. She says she reviews a list every week of people who are waiting for trial. You've got the last 30 seconds. Is that helping? Is that putting us on track to get some reform?
So I think looking at who's at Rikers, how much bail they're on, and sort of making sure that they're able to come to court so that they have their due process day in court and be able to fight in court is really critical. And I hope that some of her reforms will sort of bring to bear, and we will certainly keep having the conversation as the public defender as to what's important and what we should be rolling out in every single county in New York City.
And accountability should be both for people who are on Rikers Island as well as correctional staff.
Okay.
Thank you both for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.